Welcome to other program of photography with Faraz Haibullah. Today we are going to speak about diaphragm and aperture. So stay with me to the end of this video. I will tell you about the exposure triangle, the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. In this session, we are speaking about aperture and diaphragm. When light wants to enter from the object to the camera, it should enter first the lens. That some mechanical elements help us to let light in our camera. One of these elements is diaphragm. The diaphragm is situated somehow in the middle of the lens. Now if I want to define a diaphragm, I should tell you a diaphragm is a camera component within a lens comprised of overlapping metal blades that open and close to change to the size of the opening. They allow different level of light to pass through the sensor for controlling the aperture and depth of field of an image. And we call that hole the aperture. And light enters the camera through the aperture. When we want to check out a lens, whether the famous websites such as Aperture or the lens catalog itself, we see the sentence number of diaphragm blades, which mean how many blades are there in the diaphragm. So always when we see the word diaphragm, it means how many blades are used in the lens, which varies from 6 to 10. So the duty of the diaphragm is by opening and closing blades to control the amount of incoming light to the lens through the aperture. Before I talk about how the diaphragm works to make understanding easier, use the similarity between the human eye and camera. In the human eye, the light goes through the iris, pupil, and lens, and the image is shown on the retina. Exactly in the camera, light goes through the diaphragm, aperture, and the lens form the image on the sensor field. Now if I want to compare the diaphragm with the human eye, I can say the iris in our camera is diaphragm and the pupil is aperture. Even light function in camera is to form the image on the sensor field is so similar to the human eye. Another similarity between the diaphragm and human eye is when during days and intense light our pupil gets smaller, and exactly in camera while it faces intense light we use closer aperture, and vice versa at night and places with a low light our pupil gets bigger and we use more open aperture. Number related to aperture is shown on the LCD on the camera or the main LCD, or from inside the visor we can see it and change it. Number related to the aperture always carry an F with them, which is the abbreviation of f-stop. Now we want to know how these numbers are calculated. All lenses have an exact focal distance. The focal length in an easy way show a measure of how strongly the system converges or diverges light. But if I want to be more specific, focal length is the distance between focal spot of lens and the camera sensor. The focal length is written on all lenses, which some have variable focal length and some have the fixed focal length. So when I say I have a 7300 lens, I mean I have a lens with 7300 focal length. The other number which matters to us is the diameter of the aperture, which by closing and opening the aperture, the diameter is changed. So to calculate number related to the aperture in the camera, we divide focal length to aperture diameter. For example, our lens has a fixed focal length of 50 mm and our aperture diameter is 25 mm. If we divide 50 to 25, we see number 2. So here we have f2. Now we want to find out how closing and opening the aperture affects on our images. We can see if we have more open aperture, we have more input light. And how closer is our aperture, we have more depth of field. Well, one thing I have to say about numbers in diaphragm, which means the smaller number is the more open aperture, and the bigger number is the closer aperture. We talked about input light entering from the light source toward our camera, which diaphragm help us by closing and opening the blades to control amount of the light that enter our camera, which we see in aperture f1.2, which considered as an open aperture, we have more light input, and in f22, which is considered as a closed diaphragm, less light passes aperture. Now depth of field is the distance between the nearest and farthest object that are acceptably shared focused in an image. With the help of aperture, we are going to increase and decrease the range, and we see how close is our aperture, we have more depth of field, and more part of the image have good resolution and focused. The more open aperture is the less depth of field. For example, in portrait photography, we should focus completely on the face, and behind the object should be blue. So the depth of field should be low in this photo, which means more open aperture. But in the nature or landscape photography, we need more depth of field. It means front, behind, and all area around the object should be focused and should be sharp, so we use the close aperture. Now let's see some photos with different depth of field.